Hey everybody, I'm Ryan Doyle. This is the Verdigris Table where I teach you how to play Dungeons and Dragons, how to become a better player and have more fun, and eventually how to take your turn behind the Dungeon Master's screen. Looking forward to that stuff. But today we are sticking with this introduction to D&D sort of 101 material, and we are talking about combat. Dungeons and Dragons is a game about many things. I mean, yeah, Dungeons and Dragons, obviously, but you can play a whole session without going into a dungeon. You can play a whole campaign without meeting a dragon. It would be a shame, but it's definitely possible. In D&D, you can explore exotic, fantastical places and follow clues and, solve puzzles to discover magical treasure and incredible wealth. You can enter into the more social game of unraveling plots and dense webs of political intrigue. But one thing D&D characters do pretty well is kill monsters. Combat is one of the central pillars of D&D. It might even be the heart of the game. And if you're doing it right, when the dungeon master says roll initiative, everybody gets real excited. Maybe scared, but real excited. Now, in the other aspects of the game, in the more exploratory, social, roleplay parts of the game, things are pretty fast and loose. Anybody can pretty much do anything or attempt to do anything that they want whenever, within reason, of course, between whatever the rules of the game and then just like the social aspects of sitting around a table with your friends or maybe even strangers. But when violence breaks out, when life and death are on the line, things get much more structured. And who does what, when, in what order, becomes paramount. And initiative is how we keep track of all that. Initiative deserves its own video entirely, but the very basic idea is that you roll a d20 and you add your initiative modifier. It's going to be top, center, typically on a character sheet. Um, Essentially, it's your dexterity modifier. There's things that can change that, but whatever, real basic. You roll your d20, add your initiative modifier, and that is your initiative. That is essentially your place in line. The character that has the highest initiative result there is going to go first. The order is going to go from there, following the line, who rolled what, and the player who went first is not going to go again until the last player has gone and we enter a new round of combat. So everyone gets their turn within the round. It's possible when a fight breaks out that one side has the drop on the other. Maybe the party of adventurers has walked into an ambush and the enemies spring out of hiding. Or maybe the party has, snuck up on the enemies while they're making camp. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, if one side is trying to surprise the other, it's going to be a stealth check versus the passive perception on the other side. There's exceptions to this. The DM may just say, like, yes, you got the drop on them if someone's asleep, or if the trap is perfectly set, or whatever the case may be. It doesn't always break down like that, but oftentimes it's going to be stealth versus passive perception. So if you roll a stealth check higher than their passive perception, the passive perception becomes the DC, the difficulty class, then you have surprised the enemy. If the enemy is surprised, or if you are surprised, essentially you skip your first turn in that first round of combat. You keep your place in the initiative order, but when it comes up to you, you are surprised. You have the surprised condition, and you don't move or act. You essentially just stand there for that round, being like, what's happening? Now, on your turn, you can take an action and you can move. For many characters, their speed is 30 feet, and that's telling you how far you can move per round. Now, depending on your race and your class, you might be anywhere from 20 feet to 40 feet, maybe even further. But that's how much ground you can cover during your turn while taking an action, while doing something else. Certain spells or abilities or magic items may give you a climbing speed or a swim speed, but otherwise that kind of motion is going to be half speed essentially. So if you can go 30 feet per round, then if you are climbing a rope, you're only going to travel 15 feet per round. The same is true if you're moving across difficult terrain. So if you are trying to bushwhack through a thicket in the forest, or make your way across the ballroom floor that's covered in overturned tables and smashed cutlery and flatware, um, then you are going to be moving at half your normal speed. Now, if you're doing something cool or crazy with your movement, you're trying to swing from the chandelier, dive through the window, leap onto a moving miner's cart or chariot or something, then the dungeon master may very well call for an athletics check or an acrobatics check. And if you do that and fail, you might fall prone. You might lay out flat. There's other ways to end up prone. You can be knocked down by an enemy or an effect. If you are prone, it takes half of your movement speed to stand up. So if you're flat on the ground and you can decide to drop prone because whatever, you're hiding behind cover or something, to get up from prone takes half of your movement speed. So if you have 30 feet of movement, and you're lying down, you can stand up and travel 15 feet. And now if it's on difficult terrain, then you're moving at half speed, and then that's only 5 feet, because in D&D we round down. Now, here's a pro tip for you. You can actually break up your movement speed with your action. So if you have 30 feet of movement, you don't have to take, you don't have to move 30 feet and then take your action. You can actually, take your action and move 30 feet, or you can move 10 feet and maybe fire an arrow and then move another 10 feet, fire an arrow, move another 10 feet, and, get behind some broken wall or something to get cover. So you can do some interesting things by breaking up your movement. You don't have to take it all at one time. So to go along with your movement, we are also going to figure out where your character is located, what their position is within the fight, within the battlefield. I wrote a Heisenberg uncertainty principle joke, but I decided a Dungeons & Dragons instructional video is neither the time nor the place to make nerdy jokes. Most player characters and many enemies are going to be size small or medium, most likely medium. And small or medium creatures are going to take up a 5x5 square. That doesn't mean they're 5 feet wide, by 5 feet across. They're just in charge of, they're controlling that 5-foot square. That is their personal space. That's their zone of influence. So no other creature can get up in there. If you are playing on a map or a mat with a grid, typically those boxes are going to represent 5x5 squares because of this reason. From that 5x5 square, a character can attack in melee, can hand-to-hand combat, reach out to, well, typically another 5 feet. So every square touching it. Giants and dragons and a bunch of other creatures are going to be larger size and occupy more than that 5x5 square, and they very well may have a further reach. They may be able to go 10 feet or more. But for a lot of characters, especially player characters, you're going to take up a 5x5 square and be able to reach 5 feet further. So that means if you are more than 5 feet away from your target, you can't make a melee attack. You can't hit them with a sword or an axe. There are weapons that give you reach that will, a polearm maybe can go 10 feet out, but in a lot of cases, you're going to have to move in order to become in melee range of your target. Otherwise, if you are too far to hit with a melee attack, you can hit with a ranged attack potentially. You can fire an arrow at somebody. Every thrown or ranged weapon or spell is going to have two numbers beside it. It's going to be the normal range / the furthest it can possibly travel, right? So if something is 20-60, that means within 20 feet, it's going to be a normal attack. But if it were 25 feet in that scenario, then you are going to roll at disadvantage, right? And if it's more than 60 feet away, if the target's 65 feet away, then you have no chance of hitting them with that thrown weapon at least. It will hit the ground before it hits the target if it's more than 60 feet away. I just wanted to point out, if you are in melee combat with an opponent, if you are within 5 feet of them, then making a ranged attack against them, be it a bow and arrow or a spell, that ranged attack would be at disadvantage. And it makes sense, right? If someone is swinging a sword in your face, then it is harder to shoot a bow and arrow at them than it would be if you were standing 30 feet away, right? Or, at least I assume so. So yes, attacks. Everybody's favorite. On your turn, you get to move and take one action, and, maybe the most popular action to take is attack. Be it a melee attack with a sword, or a ranged attack with a crossbow, or maybe a spell attack with a magic spell. Attack is a very popular choice depending on your character builds, right? Their class and also their inventory. You're going to have a lot of options available to you for attacks. All of this is covered in the player's handbook. It's chapter 2. There's a bunch of stuff on combat. I'm trying to cover it briefly here, so hopefully briefly. But yes, if you are playing this game for any extended period of time, you're going to want a copy of the player's handbook. I have a link down below for my Amazon affiliate link. If you want to pick it up at your friendly neighborhood game store, please do. Or, some independent bookstore that has a pretty cool game section, then go for it. But if you want to get it online, save a couple bucks and, throw a little action my way, I would appreciate it. If you're down there poking around in the description, I'm also including the basic rules for D&D, so you don't need to buy that book to start playing this game. In fact, if you've never played before, don't spend money yet. But while you're down there, if you could also hit like and subscribe and do all that cool stuff, I deeply appreciate it. Thank you. On with the show. Now, to make an attack, you're going to roll a d20 and add the modifier, the to hit modifier for the weapon that you're using, or the spell attack modifier if you're casting a spell. And that number is going up against the target's armor class, their AC. So if you meet or beat the target's AC, then you are doing damage. You're going to roll damage dice. We have a whole galaxy of dice in D&D, and a lot of those are for damage. Every weapon, every ability may have different numbers of different dice to roll, but to hit, you're going to roll that d20, the big mama. For some spells, you're actually not rolling to hit. The target is going to roll their save, whatever that may be, a dexterity save, a constitution saving throw. We're going to do a whole series on magic once combat is wrapped up, so stay tuned for that, but just keep that in mind for now. Now, if an attack hits and the damage goes through, that number, that amount of damage gets subtracted from the target's hit points, from their HP. Once a character's HP drops to 0, they are knocked out and potentially dead, or at least dying. If it's a monster, it's up to your dungeon master, but typically if it's especially like a grunt, right, it's just a generic goblin or whatever that drops to 0 HP, then they're probably just dead. If it's a player character that drops to 0 HP, then they're going to make death saving throws. Actually, first, if a player character drops to 0 and the remaining damage, right, how far they would get pushed into the negative, if the remaining damage is equal to or greater than their total hit points, their hit point maximum, the amount that they could possibly have, if the remainder is more than that, then that is instant death. There's also a couple very high level spells, power word kill, and some real nasty poisons and traps out there in the world that again are just instant, permanent death, no saves. But for the most part, if your character drops to 0 hit points, they're going to be making death saving throws on their turn when the round comes around in combat. On their turn, they're going to be making death saving throws until they are stabilized, healed, revived, or they flat out die. Now, a death save is a straight up d20. No modifier, no advantage, disadvantage, just a roll of the dice. Chaos or fate or luck is controlling the outcome. There is a little box in the character sheet that is designed to keep track of this, right? So 3 successes, 10 or higher on the d20, and your character is stabilized. So they remain at 0 HP. They remain unconscious, but they are no longer dying. And in 1d4 hours, typically, roll a d4. In that many hours, they will, wake up with 1 HP left. 3 failed saves, though, 9 and below, 3 strikes, and they are out. They are dead, deceased, donezo. Yes, in Dungeons & Dragons, there are some very powerful resurrection magic spells. There are literal, deities that can be petitioned to, grant divine intervention. There are ways to travel to other planes of existence to maybe follow a soul into Elysium or the Nine Hells. But for particularly low-level characters, low-level parties, none of that stuff may be accessible. And a lot of times in Dungeons & Dragons, Dead means dead. It's not a video game where you can revert back to the last save point. The stakes in D&D are real, and I really like that aspect of the game myself. It makes it way more challenging and way more interesting and way more visceral sometimes. Now, another character can use their action on their turn to attempt to stabilize a character making death saves. Remember, you're making a roll once per turn, so potentially for 6 rounds you're going to be laying there dying. I mean, it could be much shorter than that. Your fellow adventurers may have the opportunity to run to your side and attempt to stabilize you. They do so by making a medicine check. The DC is 10, which is pretty low. And if they have a healer's kit, then they succeed for free as long as they have uses left in that healer's kit. So it's possible to stabilize a character who's making death saves. It is also possible to heal a character making death saving throws. You can pour a health potion down their throat, or you can cast a spell that does healing, and that character will come back up with that many hit points. If they go down again, if they hit 0 again, the clock has been reset. So if you have 1 success and 2 fails, and the cleric heals you and you come back up with 4 HP, and then pretty quickly you take 5 damage, and you're again making death saves, you're not 2-1 against, you're starting from 0. You have a clean slate. If a character is making death saves and they take damage, then that counts as 2 failures automatically. It doesn't matter how much damage, what type of damage, it is 2 failed saves. If they take damage again, that's it, they're done. They've failed 4 times, it only takes 3 to kill them outright. If a character has stabilized, then they're still sitting at 0 HP. If they take damage, then they are now making death saves again. If they take damage twice at 0 HP, once knocks them back into like that death save dying category, and then that next bout of damage makes them fail 2 death saves. So if environmental effects are happening, the ceiling is collapsing, you want to drag your companions who may be unconscious out of the way. Final thing on death saves, as you're rolling, if you hit a natural 20, if you roll a 20 while you're making a death save, then congratulations, you pop back up to life with 1 HP, conscious and aware and ready to move and act on your next turn. However, if you roll a 1, then again, that is 2 failed death saves. Pretty scary. Now, in the skills and saves video, we talked about how treating a 1 and a 20 is optional in, saves and skills. That is not the case with death saves. Rules as written, RAW, raw, player's handbook, a 1 and a 20 do this, period. Not optional. That being said, I'm a huge supporter of home brewing. Whatever works at your table, go for it. I will make an argument that the, real specter of death makes Dungeons and Dragons a much more powerful, interesting game, and, kind of sanding off the edges of that player mortality lessens the play experience for the Dungeon Master and for the PCs, for sure, for the other players at the table. So, take that with a grain of salt. I mean, nobody wants to see their favorite character die, and a lot of times the Dungeon Master doesn't want to kill their friends, because that's can be what it feels like. But those are the most memorable moments, and some of my favorite characters are no longer with us. So, yes, real stakes make for better stories and better games. And rant. Natural 1s and natural 20s, also, rules as written, are going to be significant when we roll to hit with a spell or a weapon attack. And no one really homebrews this to not count for anything. There's plenty of homebrew variations on fumbles and crits, and those are cool, and maybe we'll make a video about that one day. But rules as written, if you roll a natural 1, it doesn't matter what the modifiers are that are going to get added into that. It doesn't matter what the target's armor class is. If you roll a 1, the attack fails. Perhaps catastrophically, perhaps comedically, but a 1 never hits. On the flip side, a 20 always hits. It doesn't matter what the modifier is, what the AC is. A natural 20 always hits, and the damage dice get doubled when you score a critical hit. The method I prefer is to roll, if you're 2d8 damage on whatever spell that you have scored a natural 20 on, then you're going to roll 4d8. And then you add the modifier. The modifiers on the damage don't get doubled, but any other, bonus damage die do. So if it's the ranger has Hunter's Mark on the target, or it's a sneak attack from a rogue, then all of those dice get doubled. If you are, having a hard time doing the math under pressure, and as the, levels increase, the die increase, and if you're about to roll an absurd amount of dice and you don't want to make your friends watch you add them up, whatever, you can, roll the normal amount of dice and then just double that total. Or, rolling dice is fun. You just roll more dice, roll those dice 2 times over. Whichever method you prefer, obviously go with, but I will say choose one and stick with it. I don't let my players, roll, and if it's a low total, then you know what, I'm going to roll it again. If you're going to just double the dice, x2, then that's what we're doing all the time. If you're going to roll the dice 2 times over, then do that, go for it. Now, your class and your race potentially, and maybe magic items or feats that you have taken can all grant you special attacks, but there are a few variations on the attack action that everyone has access to. The first special attack is grappling, essentially wrestling, or putting your opponent in a hold. You are going to make an athletics check, not an attack roll. You're going to make an athletics check, and that's going to be contested by the target's athletic check or their acrobatics check. If you succeed and the target isn't more than 1 size larger than you are, now the target speed is 0. They can't go anywhere. Furthermore, you can actually drag them along with you. You would move at half speed, but you can force them to move with you. On their turn, the creature being grappled can try to break it, again with an acrobatics or an athletics check that goes against your new athletics check. So the grapple doesn't do any damage, but it can be super useful in certain circumstances. If the enemy has, broken ranks in defeat and they're fleeing and you really need answers, you can grab one of them before they get away. Alternatively, I don't know, if, putting the hobgoblin in a headlock is going to potentially make all the other goblins drop their weapons and stop fighting, cool, quick way to victory. If your whole objective is to take a prisoner or a hostage or, rescue someone who's being mind controlled, then grapple is also just like a great arrow to have in your quiver. Shove is going to be pretty similar to grapple in a lot of ways. You are rolling an athletics check contested against their athletics or acrobatics, and they can't be more than 1 size larger than you are for this to work. And if you're paying attention, you might kind of see that the defender here, in both cases, is going to have a little bit of an advantage because they are getting to choose which skill modifier they get to use. But if you are a strong character, a grapple or a shove can be super useful in the right circumstances, because if we're successful at shoving our opponent, we can either push them back away from us 5 feet, or we can knock them prone. So, if we're fighting on a cliff, then obviously pushing a character off the cliff could be very useful in combat. But knocking them prone, if the environment isn't to our advantage or we can't, get them into a trap or something, knocking them prone is going to be super useful as well a lot of the time. One, if we're trying to escape, right, knocking down the big bad evil guy and running away gives you an advantage because it takes half their movement speed to stand up now. But 2, if the target is prone, then any melee attack made against them is at advantage, right? So if you have 2 attacks, you can use one of them to shove, and you can use the second one to use a melee weapon. And by level 5, most of the melee classes are going to have 2 attacks. So that would give you, if you succeed at the shove, then you're going to have advantage on your next attack with your weapon, and the ally beside you is also going to have advantage on their attacks against the target. One note, ranged attacks against a prone target are actually at disadvantage, so keep that in mind. It makes sense, right? You're presenting a smaller target, so it's harder to hit with a crossbow from across the room. Also useful if you're facing off against a bunch of archers and you can't close the distance or hit them. Consider dropping prone. You can do that always. It doesn't cost movement to drop, it costs movement to stand up. But yeah, run serpentine and then hit the ground. The other kind of special attack is going to be the knockout, or often referred to as the non-lethal damage. If you drop an enemy to 0 HP, you can declare, if it's with a melee attack, you can declare that you are knocking them out, not outright killing them. And you can actually declare that as you find out you are dropping them to 0. It feels like you should know whether or not you're going to hit them with the flat of the sword or the sharp side of the sword before you make contact. But rules as written, you can declare, okay, this is non-lethal damage when you find out that you've dropped them to 0 HP. Keep in mind, this is melee attacks only. You can pull a punch, right? You can hit someone with the pommel of the sword instead of the point. But you can't do this with a ranged attack, right? An arrow is an arrow. A fireball is a fireball. There's only melee attacks giving you the ability to do non-lethal damage. And again, it's not hard to imagine where this might be useful if you need, to take a prisoner for interrogation, or, to parlay in the future, perhaps a prisoner exchange or a ransom scenario. There are plenty of reasons why you might not want to kill everything that you're fighting, right? Maybe you just want the raging mama owl bear that, you stepped into their den with their cubs by accident. You want them to stop trying to kill you, but maybe you don't want to kill them outright. All right, so that's a very basic introduction to combat in Dungeons and Dragons. Roll initiative, figure out if anybody's surprised, move, act, probably by attacking, roll high, don't die. And a couple special attacks in there for flavor. There's a whole host of other things that we can do with our action on our turn, and some other stuff that you should know going into combat in D&D. So coming up in part 2, we're going to cover the rest of all of that. But until then, get out there, have fun, play this game, enjoy it, enjoy, just each other's company. This is a great way to bring people together and have a good time, and we need more of that these days. So yeah, have fun, be kind, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.